I'm going to introduce you to next speakers, and at the conclusion of their presentation, everyone's going to sit on the couch, all four speakers, and Suzanne's going to again facilitate our last panel before we finish today. So if I could just introduce to you both Professor Andrew Hickey and Adam Wenatong.
Look, thank you for that introduction. I probably don't deserve the accolades just yet. Look, I'd like to acknowledge the Jarrong people in the Western Waka Waka Nation and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to note my co-speaker today and say that I'm a little bit overawed actually to be up with such talent. I'll do my best. Look, Adam and I had a little chat just before. We figured that, look, you know, much like a gig, this last session must be the main act, right? This is what you really paid your tickets for, but don't dispel that myth at all, and no shame to other speakers, of course, but just let us believe that. Do I have some slides? There we are. Look, the title slide here, as astute observers, you will know that I've rather poorly ripped off Gil Scott-Heron's famous line, the revolution will not be televised. And what Scott-Heron was referring to with that particular line was that social change, that it's not just about sitting back, you know, you've got to get involved. And what I wanted to talk about a little bit today, and I'm going to sort of refer to some of Ross's work, which I follow closely and admire a lot. It has done a hell of a lot, in fact, to sort of articulate the challenges that we see currently in this state in particular. But I want to talk about what it means to engage in meaningful change. I'm going to riff a little bit on some of the empirical work that I've done with groups of young folks across southeast Queensland and beyond. And I'll have some of those folks speaking on the slides that I'll refer to soon. But look, this homage to Gil Scott-Heron is about suggesting that social change isn't something that occurs out there, beyond us. What Scott-Heron was actually saying is that it's with us. It's with the consciousness that we carry. It's with the sentiment that we like to approach the world with and how we see our fellow other. So just keep that in mind. I'll come back to that sentiment soon, how it is we understand and see our fellow other. Now, I'll just get this thing to work. Marcus Barham, in a particularly useful chronicle of Gil Scott-Heron's famous line, he provided this sort of declaration of what it meant. He said that what Gil meant in the song, and it's obvious from hearing the lyrics, is that you have to be active. You can't be a passive participant in the revolution. When the revolution happens, you're going to have to be on the streets. If you want to make change in society, you have to get off your ass and take action. I love that line. This is what we do, of course. This is what we're primed to do. That's why we're here today. We each, in our own way, get off our ass. We're here because we have a deep conviction towards what it is we want to see in the world and have happen from our various professional backgrounds and our orientations towards social justice. We attack that in different ways, but nonetheless around that central concern for making the world a better place than it currently is. When it comes to young people in particular, there's unprecedented attention given to young people. And that really worries me as someone who's spent the better part of my professional life, a little bit over 20 years, dealing with how it is that young people engage with the world and are treated by the world, are engaged into the world. I get really, really disheartened actually with what's going on currently. And what I wanted to do is just talk a little bit about the way that we understand young people as a society, and how there are a range of inflections to that understanding that filter through, but nonetheless that there are predominant and dominant and largely pathologised understandings of young people that circulate and that gain currency. Now, look, fair enough, you might think this is all very romanticised and appealing in its own particular way, and as critically informed folks like me and Adam, we probably wouldn't have too much issue with that. I'm in safe company here. I can say these things without being heckled, which is lovely. But if you do feel the need to heckle. So I wanted to start with this line of reasoning to identify an uneasy contradiction, that, as I see it at least, that rests in the ways that young people have come to be represented, particularly lately, in light of the current youth crime crisis as it's known here in regional Queensland especially, and how action in response to this has subsequently emerged in a series of quite divergent ways. There are a number of competing responses to the current youth crime crisis and to the larger figuration of young people generally that I think it'd be worthwhile articulating and teasing out a little bit. So while I have sympathy, deep sympathy in fact, for Scott Heron's clarion call, one that invokes the radical spirit of direct action and what we might call an ethic of sticking it to the man, it is with how this call for action actually generates into practice that the problem emerges. We're seeing a lot of action in response to the problem happening in society. We express our own responses, but there are other ways of responding too, some of them deeply problematic. So while my own romanticised notions of critical action and consciousness-informed responses to the situation might conjure the sort of lefty radicalism that folks of my type often wax lyrical over, and often gain the ire from the Courier Mail over, it occurs that it isn't the only positionality, the only way to speak, and there's the problem. So what I'm saying here is that it's all well and good to assume that we must come to our own conclusions and seek to gain insight into the problems that surround us. But how should one actually arrive at a conclusion? Is in fact there a right conclusion? Is in fact there a wrong conclusion? This is what I just want to start to tease out a little bit. Academics like me have a lot of trouble for this, particularly post-structurally minded academics who think that all viewpoints are valid in their own way. Well, actually no. By doing that, I think we sort of forget the moral ethical basis that some opinions are just shit. Thanks, Loz. So, for instance, this is in response, in fact, to one of Ross's very measured, rational and very sensible commentaries that happen to gain a little bit of attention around the place. That's the reference to where Ross has been referenced, and Ross, I did appreciate and enjoy that commentary that you provided, but I was concerned, I guess, about some of the commentary that was fed back to that. There's examples there. I'll point you to Hoppies. I don't think that's the birth name of that particular contributor, but nonetheless, Hoppy, as I assume Hoppy may well be male. Suze, that's enough out of you. Look, now one might assume that the sort of radical action and contributions, incursions into the world that Gil Scott Heron was talking about are not these sorts of ones. You can see where I'm going here, that there might be right and wrong ways to actually interact into the world. I'd say, and I hope that you agree, that that's a bad way to respond to the situation. And I'm not trying to make light of this at all, actually. That's a really desperately problematic way to respond to the world. It speaks heavily, I think, to a potential for vigilantism, which worries me deeply, particularly in and around Toowoomba and some parts of the Sunshine Coast at the moment. Vigilantism is a desperate worry. So while we might challenge the moral ethical foundations of these sorts of views, and perhaps the basic lack of humanity that adheres to views of this type, these are, for better or worse, indicative of the sorts of views that at least a portion of our population hold. I have been, as I'm sure you probably have too, been in company where views like this have been openly expressed. I was at a barbecue recently where otherwise very mild-mannered, seemingly sensible people were expressing these sorts of views in exasperation to some of their own encounters with burglaries and other violence. I can sort of understand that, but I'm also horrified by the tenor of those sorts of views. So what do we do with this? Now, an easy rendering of this current situation would identify the problem, the youth crime crisis as we've come to know it, as constituted in terms of a basic binary. That on one side we've got bad kids doing bad things up against good communities that are just trying to get by. That's certainly the sort of imagery that we see presented in mainstream media and often in various social media derivations of that, you know, and some of you might well be aware of one of the most horrendous bits of social media around that is the Toowoomba Crime Watch page. It is just an extraordinary thing. Just extraordinary. I have colleagues in the QPS who say they spend quite a bit of their time, in fact, monitoring that page to work out where the next little eruption of vigilantism is going to come from. That's not a good use of resources, unfortunately. You know, So this is an important aspect of this current crisis, I think, that the way we understand as a society what the problem is and who our young people are in relation to that problem relates directly to how we conceptualise things like retribution and punishment. But it is the way that young people have been mediatised and characterised in very, very deliberate ways, in very normative ways, that holds implications for all of us as a society. So under this simple logic of this binary of bad young people who do bad things in otherwise good communities, we see a basic punitive response called for. These bad people, these bad crimes must be punished. This is a logic that has a cosmology right back to Christian sort of modes of thinking about good and bad, falls from grace, all this sort of stuff. We can talk about the philosophy of this later on, but you know what I mean. So interestingly though, there's a further inflection to this characterisation that's worth sort of thinking through, because it also implies a certain level of agency, but a really, really problematic sense of agency, a negative agency perhaps as it is, that these bad young folks are not just bad, but they're also empowered. They become threatening. They're indeed powerful. Now, that these bad young people roam the streets as active agents in these otherwise good communities is sort of the impression that we're starting to get from the mainstream media. The Courier Mail peddles this beautifully as one example of the broader, conflagration of the Murdoch press. So what we see then is this sort of, very Clockwork Orange approach to who the young person is. They may not wear outfits precisely like that, but you know what I mean. Bad and menacing young people up against good and vulnerable communities. Now, there is, of course, far more to the situation than this. We know this to be true. As we know, many of the young folks implicated in the current youth crime crisis have, in fact, their own traumas and their own pathologies. Ross's work again tells us this quite definitively. They aren't actually so powerful or bold, but are dealing with the legacies of their own vulnerability. But this isn't clear-cut in the predominant messages we see. The prevailing discourses, the prevailing narratives we hear about young people miss that bit of the equation. There is far more to the lives of these young people and the reasons for why they are in the situations that they are in, and that deserves sympathy and deep empathy, I think. So I argue then that the ways that young people are mediatised is in fact a significant part of the problem. The views that we as a community hold on issues like this current crime crisis are mediated in very deliberate but always narrow ways. The assumptions writ through these mediations invoke very simplistic, binaristic ways of thinking and responding that actually don't have any basis in empirical truth or fact. And here is where a large part of the problem, I think, generates. If you have, rhetorically speaking, within your understanding of the world, a view that young people are threatening and menacing, it then becomes, ipso facto, difficult to hold any sympathy for those bad people who do these bad things. These are just bad kids who should be punished. This provides the ambit claim for the argument here. I was in a conversation with some folks recently who, elderly folks who, through their own processes of rationalisation and had sort of been reading the newspapers, hadn't had direct contact with the crime themselves, but had decided to build an 8-foot tall Besser block wall around their house, effectively turning that house into a compound, which in fact made them more vulnerable. Things like home fires, these people were elderly, they weren't overly mobile, these sorts of things, but nonetheless were going to great expense to build this concrete-filled Besser block wall for the fear they assumed was out there. Well, that is a disaster for everyone, an absolute disaster. So the way we understand and position young people as folk devils, as Stan Cohen's great line from the early 1970s suggests, is limited and then prone to narrow conceptualisation. But this way of viewing the world is in fact out there, but it nonetheless runs the risk of invoking fear and trepidation that may not be warranted, actually. Fears that in turn categorise all young people, and that's the kicker. Yes, there are some young people involved in crime. Indeed, we see this. but when it becomes emblematic for all young people, we've got a whole other set of problems then that accrue from that. So this secondary aspect of the current youth crisis is, I think, very significant. In my recent research conducted with my team on what we call the Youth Community Futures Research Program based here at USQ, I've been working with groups of young folks, talking to them directly, engaging in what is called phenomenographic research, ethnographic and phenomenographic research, to ask these young guys about how it is they feel as part of their communities, if indeed they feel as part of their communities. And indeed, it was perhaps not surprising that some of them relayed that they didn't now feel part of their communities. And I just want to demonstrate that with this particular clip.
All these perceptions around what youth are doing, what youth believe, that it does really upset me, because it's, you're not youth, why are you telling me what I believe?
They're not like the other people, they believe it. The other night my friend, she lost her phone and she had to get home, but she couldn't call her parents. So she went up to this old couple and she asked for their help, but they said that they wouldn't help her because of all, you know, the youth crime going around. And it's like, man, like, if we can't even go to look for help anymore from the older generation, who do we get help from?
Are you really a part of the community if half of it perceives you as criminals walking around the streets trying to steal their phones? Is that really a community if you're too afraid to lend someone a hand when they need it?
Two wonderfully articulate and considered young folks, and they're representative of some of the young folks we've been working with across southeast Queensland recently. Look, what conclusion might we draw from that? I'd say, perhaps, as a start, that more complex renderings and social narratives around our young people are required urgently, as a very simple first response. We must, as a society, develop deeper and more accurate understandings of our young people, and in particular, those who feel that criminality or are exposed to criminality, feel that criminality is an appropriate life course or are exposed to that criminality. We need to hear their stories in order to understand that positionality so we can turn that around. Now, in different ways, most of the speakers across these last 2 days have said something along those lines, and that's notable, that we can all be sort of roughly in agreement on that. That is notable. If we can accept, in fact, that most people don't set out in life to become bad, it is incumbent on us as a society to seek some understanding then of what leads someone into a difficult situation, a socially pathologised situation, and then what it is we must do, not might do, must do, to support that person. It follows that there is a responsibility amongst the mainstream media in particular, but us generally as a society. I speak here as a communications and media scholar. I'm a sociologist by training with a focus on youth sociology, but also in communications media, hence my ranting about the media. But there is a basic responsibility that has been neglected by the mainstream media for the sake of a quick buck. I think it is that simple. But that's horrendous, absolutely horrendous. So sensationalist headlines that feed on public fear, stoke public fear, are not the response we require, clearly. These might well sell newspapers, but they do not make us stronger as a society. They fracture us. In fact, to continue with sensationalist headlines and inflammatory stories has the following implications. First, it creates folk devils out of folks who actually require our support. But second, it creates a fearful community. That's what I used to call, back in my younger days, a bastard act. These folks knowingly do this to flip papers. It is that simple. Oh, sorry, hang on. As Stuart Hall, one of my favourite scholars, the cultural studies scholar from the UK, Stuart Hall and colleagues noted in the classic 1972, again, not a new book by any means, classic 1972 Sociology of Media Reporting, titled Policing the Crisis, the media do not simply and transparently report events which are naturally newsworthy in themselves. News is the end product of a complex process which begins with a systematic sorting and selecting of events and topics according to a socially constructed set of categories. As a cultural studies scholar, he's prone to a little bit of hyperbole. So what that then means is that, look, you know, news comes actually from what newspaper editors think we want to see. So it's not quite as easy as then to say, oh, the bloody Murdoch press. No, 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 no. We've got to do something here as well. So while we might accept that this is how the news gets made, especially the commercial news, which has its commercial prerogative at core in terms of selling newspapers or TV airtime and so on, the important insight in this observation from Hall and his colleagues is that the news derives a socially constructed set of categories that we're all implicit in. What Hall and colleagues identified is that we as a society want our bad guys, actually. In our desire to seek easy explanations of the world and to explain away the things that we see around us, having the foil of the bad guy is fairly handy. We tend to think binaristically. We need our bad guys societally to condone the positionality that we hold as good guys. Under the guise of a binary, the bad and the good are locked within this dualism, a biunal arrangement, but one that doesn't really have much to do with the actual complexities of the situation. When was the last time you saw or read a news report, whether on the TV, the socials, the newspapers, wherever you gain your news, that told you something about the actual challenges that sit behind the headlines of bad young people? We don't. We don't hear those things. That would be an easy thing to change. How about a more empathetic and sympathetic rendering of who young people are with that sort of storying? We could do it, but we don't. This sort of inquiry doesn't fit the narrative of our socially constructed categories or the narratives of newspapers. This then is why I make this claim that the current crisis is as much a media problem as it is a crime problem. We have publics reacting to a narrow rendering of the situation, we have policy that does much the same, and we have an inflamed public that wants responses right now, but simple responses, not meaningful responses. What we don't have are complex renderings, complex understandings of the challenges that many young people face, many young people in circumstances of crime face day to day, and the succession of pathologies that lead them to where they are. Yes, it is horrendous that homes are being broken into and cars are being stolen. It isn't right that people are being assaulted, but we need to take stock of the situations that the folks involved in those crimes, how they come to that. Again, as I said before, most people don't set out in life to become bad. So if I could finish on this note, the way that we come to understand our world and indeed the pathologies it contains is crucial to how do we come to understand each other. When limited renderings of groups and situations inform our understandings, we cannot possibly ever hope to respond effectively to the actualities of the problem. To understand the world and the experiences of others is a responsibility. To, as Gil Scott Heron implores, take a deeper look and to generate a more nuanced understanding of the situations and then act on that as individuals, responsible individuals. Part of this will involve expecting more from our media outlets, indeed, whether these in the form of the mainstream news or the socials or wherever, but also too, we play a part in that. Let's call this out. Get hold of Jordan Philp at the Chronicle and say this is not good enough. We could do that. So what might this world look like, this idealist, this lefty-leaning world that I'm talking about? Well, look, Bob's presentation yesterday was insightful, as Bob always is, but I just want to riff a little bit on the 2018 report, which is a really important document, as you well know. Bob notes in that by intervening early when risk factors associated with antisocial or criminal behaviour are evident, provides a much greater chance of preventing a child's later involvement in socially pathological crime and problems, social problems. There's an important qualification here that I just want to sort of amplify, and that is that prevention and early intervention is a whole of community and a whole of government responsibility. Bob's used that word responsibility. It's an important word, but it's a whole of community. This emphasis on whole of community is significant. I suspect that this phrase typically conjures within the imagination imagery of families and neighbourhoods and tree-lined streets and all those sorts of wonderful sort of community-like sort of images. But within this, I want to get beyond just that sort of superficial level of understanding about what an effective community looks like to say, well, hang on, who are we within that then? What responsibilities do we bear? Now, there'll be 1,000 different ways we could activate that, but we must activate it nonetheless. We, as folks engaged in the sort of work that we do, are at that front line, in fact. So, indeed, I would say this, not necessarily as a conclusion or any sort of answer necessarily, but perhaps as just an assertion, that if we are to respond to this crisis, we will need better informed understandings of the complexity of the situation and then find ways to be able to talk to each other about that complexity. Thank you.